Hello, Finland. Sean Blenkinsop here. Nice to see you. I hope it's a nice day there. And you're outside, sitting on your porch, enjoying this time together. To begin, I have to say I'm honored. Thank you very much for the invitation to give this talk. I'm super sorry it's such a weird year and I have to be here and you're over there. Maybe next time I could come and be there live, give a workshop and meet you all. Big thanks to Anna and Maya for inviting me. Big thanks to Kai and Arya for doing the response. Hopefully there's enough stuff in this talk to give them something fun to talk about. Big thanks to Jane, my camera person, helping me out. A couple of things I want to do before I get into the talk. First, I want to acknowledge where I am. I'm standing here talking to you on the unceded territory of the Squamish First Nations. They were here since time immemorial. They speak a language that rises from this land, and they cared for this land for generations in really rich ways. And Jane's just panning up a tree. This is a Douglas fir. It's one of the anchor trees of the temperate rainforest here on the west coast of Canada. This tree is probably about 500 to 550 years old. So it was an almost 100-year-old tree back when Columbus decided to come along and sail over here. Just back before this tree was here, before the colonizer came, before the land was taken in that kind of way. A couple other things I need to tell you, probably a little bit about me. I'm a professor at Simon Fraser University. I'm a philosopher of education. That's really my training as an academic, which Anna and Maria seem to think was a good idea, that I could do both the philosophical, which you in Finland do a lot of, and I could do the sort of more practical, because my background is as an outdoor educator. I've worked as a guide, I've worked at Outward Bound, I've worked at outdoor ed centers, and lately I've been working with schools, doing a lot of work with schools, trying to think about how you redo the curriculum, how you rethink public education to make it more ecological, to undo some of the sort of modernity structures that I think are actually anti-environmental, that get in the way of building a relationship to the natural world. And I think we need to think about education as being a mechanism for change if we're going to respond to climate change, if we're going to respond to biodiversity crisis, if we're going to respond to all these kinds of things. But you all know this. My hope is that maybe my varied background actually matches the varied background of all of you listening. A couple more things. I'm going to try to speak more slowly. I tend to speak quickly when I get excited. And two, I'll try to enunciate well, knowing that English may not be the first language of a lot of you. And clearly it's not my first language either. What I want to do now is I want to do two little kind of 10-minute drops, two little 10-minute talks. My hope is that they'll be interesting, exciting. I won't stuff them with content. And in between, I want to give you a chance to do some activities. We're experiential educators after all, and the activities, I think, will give you a chance to kind of at least be outside, play outside, acknowledge being outside, bring the natural world into your thinking and into your conversations. But it also means that I'll be able to just give these sort of little pieces. A quick frame that might work for the talk is you can think about the talk as being a nature as talk, ... nature as ... The first half, what I'm going to try and do is do nature as community. And then I'll try to push it a little bit and do nature as culture. And then what I'm going to do is push it one more step and talk about nature as colonized. And then I'll give you a chance to do an activity to think about those kinds of ideas. And then we'll come back. I promise the second half will be maybe a little bit more hopeful, a touch less dark, maybe give us a sense of how to respond to these kinds of questions, particularly if to the nature as colonized kind of discussion. All right, so here we go. Let's start with nature as community. My guess is this is actually a pretty easy sell for most of you, that out here in this natural world, in this forest, right, you actually have a community. That's what's going on, right? You have interactions happening. You have conversations happening. I don't know if you can see up on the slope, but you've got a couple of what we call candy cane fungi. They're fungi that actually live off the roots of the trees. They don't photosynthesize. They live off the roots of the trees. And what do? Well, they provide food back. They move nitrogen. They shift carbon back and forth in this forest. There's been some recent work by a professor at UBC named Suzanne Simard that you might want to check out. Her book's called The Mother Tree. I'm not completely convinced by the title, but her suggestion is that trees like this Douglas fir, being the old trees, being the matriarchs of the forest, have these really, really complex communication networks, have these really, really complex connections to most of the trees in the area. The connections come through the rhizomes, right? But this mother tree then transfers food to her kin, to her baby trees. You can see there's one over there that's probably 250 years old, probably a daughter. But the mother tree can also clearly, in the evidence, transfers food and information to trees not even of her own species. And in fact, Suzanne Simard has found that these Douglas fir trees, when they're young, grow best in combination with birch and alder. That what happens is the birch and alder both protect the tree and transfer food to the tree, because birch and alder in a new forest grow more quickly and therefore would shade out the tree. And so here in Canada, loggers said, well, we need to get rid of all those trees and just plant the fir. But the fir don't grow as well if you get rid of the aspen and you get rid of the birch. So there's a community going on there. There's a sort of mutual working together happening in that kind of conversation. I'm sure the same thing happens at a kind of ground level in Finland, in your boreal forest, in your northern boreal forest. All right. Other things about community. What else happens in communities? Well, there are young, there are old. Just over here, you'll see that kind of classic sort of bump of a nurse log. And on the nurse log is a young huckleberry that grows into the nurse log, finds a little bit of a gap in the canopy, gathers some food from the nurse log, actually will often tap into some of the old root systems, right? And on top of it, on the other side of the huckleberry, there's a little hemlock, a little western hemlock. Another one of the anchor trees eventually will grow to be this big. You should note also the fire scars on this baby. There was a big fire about 200 years ago that came through this area. So that's nature as community. I think you're probably pretty comfortable with that. Now I'm going to push it. I'm going to push it a little bit and talk about, can we consider this system, this ecosystem, this place as a culture? One way to think about that is that what cultures do is that there's a sort of diversity of cultures in different places. Think about your northern boreal forest in Finland. It's different from this place. Things operate differently. The trees interact differently. The species that are present are different. The voices of the birds are different. There's a little Pacific wren just above me calling right now. You can just hear it in the treetops. You don't have a Pacific wren. So that's a different voice, right? The way in which communication happens, that's different. So could this be a culture? And maybe that's a different kind of culture. Now, we do use the language of culture in science as well. What else can we think about culture? One of the things that we do as humans is we say, well, what about the arts? What about beauty? That's part of culture. I wonder if this is this place beautiful? For many of you, that's a pretty easy answer. But what about the act of creating something for the purposes of attracting another, for the purposes of talking to another, for the purposes of being recognized by another? We have flowers here that do that all the time. We have these tiny little orchids that attract only a specific species of ground-dwelling bee. Right? So in fact, what happens is the orchid creates beauty, creates an artistic piece, and the bee is drawn to it. And the orchid gets a kind of response. All right? I know, I'm pushing it. Are you all right with that? How are we doing for time? Okay. I'm going to go to the next step. Play with this notion of nature as culture a little bit. Now I'm going to go to nature as colonized, because I think this has big implications for how we as educators think about this. So I'm going to back up into some philosophical literature. In the 1970s, in North Africa, there was a real movement of anti-colonial conversation going on. There were scholars, African scholars, who were starting to speak to each other, who were starting to push back against a sort of European push in terms of how to think, how to be a scholar and stuff like that, and who were interested in the experience of being African and what that meant as an African. And this is Frantz Fanon was in this kind of conversation, Albert Memmi, Albert Cesare. These are the sort of M.A. Cesare. These are the sort of people who were involved in this kind of conversation. And Albert Memmi ends up writing a famous book called The Colonizer and the Colonized. And it was a kind of anti-colonial book, one of the first anti-colonial books, one of the first books where the colonized actually had a voice and actually started talking to each other without trying to pass it through the sort of European conversation. And what Mimi does in that book is he lays out a series of traits, of examples, of ways in which the colonizer works to make one colonized, of experiences of being colonized. I'll just give you a couple. One of them, and this was classic in the African example, was to make all of Africa into a single object, to undo all of the languages, all of the cultures, all of the diversity in that, and just call it Africa, right? Which was, in fact, what it did was it froze the notion of Africa in a particular kind of way. And then the colonizer could just speak in sort of general terms. Well, Africa is this, or Africa is that, right? So that was step number one. Step number two was, in doing that, what was also done was the voice of those folks who were in Africa gets ignored, right? They become voiceless. So the colonizer becomes the expert on Africa, freezes Africa, and then doesn't hear the voices of those who are colonized. That does a couple of things. One, it makes the colonized voiceless, but two, it also means the colonized can't critique what the colonizer is saying. In some ways, it freezes the colonized historically, right? So now the colonizer has frozen them historically and can claim to know it the best, right? Next step of the colonial move is to then say any of that history, any of that past is insignificant. It's not important. It wasn't sophisticated. It wasn't interesting. Those cultures, they didn't have rich religious traditions. They didn't have rich governance traditions. Thank heavens the colonized came in and took over. Okay, so there's a couple of different sort of things that happen. And Mimi points to this series of things that go on in the move to colonize a space. Now, my argument is that Western modernity has done a very, very similar kind of thing in response to the natural world. Just think about it. We talk about the natural world. We talk about it as the environment. And if we're really good, really, really good, we distinguish between a Douglas fir and a Western hemlock. Now, we don't distinguish this particular Douglas fir or that particular Western hemlock. Like if we're really good and we really know about the world, we get down to sort of a species level and we can distinguish between species. But there's a kind of freezing, as if the natural world were one uniform thing, just like as if Africa were one uniform thing. We ignore the intricacies, we ignore the diversity. We also ignore the languages that were going on. We ignore the way in which birth and death happens. We ignore the ways in which resources are transferred. We ignore the ways in which challenges are resolved, disagreements are solved. We ignore all of that kind of stuff. Just like Mimi suggests, the colonizer freezes and then ignores the constructs that are going on and undoes any sense of a history. This is a 550-year-old tree. What does it know about history? Right? Ignores any of that history and makes them voiceless. So we no longer hear the trees, we no longer hear the birds, and we no longer think they have rights because they have no past, they're insignificant, they're frozen, and we, the colonizer, know best about them. All right? Does that make sense? So that's just a tiny little drop on Nature is Colonized. I'm going to send you off to do an activity. All right? I'm not giving you anything. Maybe we'll give you, say, 10, 15 minutes. The conference organizer can tell you for sure what we want with that. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to put your stuff down, find a quiet space, find a natural space, spend some time there. Just quietly kind of see if you can get invited in, see if a space calls to you. Settle in and spend a little bit of time there. You're all really good at this probably, right? Now I want you to just listen and look, see what's happening. Is there communication going on? How does communication work? What's happening? How does birth happen? How does death happen? Is there any art? What's the beauty look like? Does that make sense? So just spend some time seeing how does this operate, right? This is an autopoietic organism in this space. Right? It organizes itself. It's been able to organize itself for thousands and thousands of years. How does it do that? What's going on? Right? And then, once you've done that, play with that for a little while, I want you to just think into the politics of this place. Right? And this is where we're going to get at this Nature is Colonized piece. Right? Is there a voice? Does this place have a voice politically? Right? How is it treated by the humans in the local area? What's the human political history? A really interesting note right here, just up this watershed, was a Chinese lumber camp. So it was folks from China, men from China, brought from China to be part of this lumber camp here. But the North Americans who were living here, the white North Americans living here, were so racist they wouldn't work with the Chinese. So there was a Chinese camp separated here. So there's a deep politics even in the logging industry that existed here. There's actually also a Japanese camp a little farther along. So we have this this politics. We have racism built into this kind of stuff. But then we also have the ownership of the land and who owns the land. There were no treaties signed with the Squamish in terms of using this land. There was no discussion about whether or not these fantastic trees that are spiritual anchors and ancestors and brethren, they are kinfolk to the Squamish folk. There was no discussion about whether or not they could be removed or left, or which ones would be, or what the implications would be for the Squamish people, the Squamish language, the Squamish presence in this place. All right, so go off, have some fun, enjoy that, and I'll have a second drop for you in 10 or 12 minutes. Welcome back. Hope that was interesting. And there's some stuff to think about. I'm going to introduce you to a Western red cedar. I've just moved a little bit just so you can see another one of the anchor trees. This is a key spiritual tree for the Squamish folk. It's also key in a lot of their building. They would build massive ocean-going canoes out of this and paddle up and down the shore of BC. It was also an important medicine tree. We're guessing, we're not totally sure about this, but we're guessing that this groove that runs right up the middle of this tree, where it looks like the bark has been removed, was actually removed, was culturally removed. And they would use the bark itself for weaving hats and doing rugs and doing a lot of their clothing. The fantastic thing about the weaves with the cedar is that it would weave the clothing, and it would, in dry times, the weave would spread a little bit, and so they'd get air coming through to cool. But then when it got wet, the weave would expand and it would close down, so it was actually waterproof. Super cool. Anyway, what I want to do is I want to do a little bit more talking about education itself and talking a little bit about some of our experiences at these schools, at the public schools. One of the schools is called the Maple Ridge Environmental School, and it's been going for 10 years. And it's a school that does kindergarten through to grade 7. And it's outside all the time. It has no building at all. So rain, wind, snow, doesn't matter. It's outside all the time, which I think you have quite a bit of experience with in terms of your early childhood education and kids spending lots of time outside. So same thing happens here. And part of what we were going for in that school was to try and think much more seriously about how we undo some of the structures that undergird schooling, but also how we start to think about the natural world as being a co-teacher. So here we go. Remember, the theme last time was nature as community, nature as culture, nature as colonized. This time I'm going to try to do a little bit about nature as co-teacher, and maybe, and at one point in time when I met with the organizers, they said, Sean, do something that you're really passionate about. I'm really passionate about the natural world. I'm really passionate about education, but I've actually been playing with this new idea for a little while, and I'm going to offer it to you and see what you think. You can play with it too. In some ways, maybe it would be called nature as co-imaginer, but I'll play with that in a second. First, I want to do a little bit around nature as co-teacher, and I want to start with the Maple Ridge Environmental School. So at the Maple Ridge Environmental School, part of what we were trying to do was to try to have this conversation about what happens if you take the natural world seriously, if you think it has intrinsic rights, if you think it has a voice, if you think it's active, if you think it has agency, and we go outside. Remember, my background, lots of outdoor stuff, lots of guiding, lots of that kind of stuff, probably like a lot of you. I tended not to think about the natural world as a co-teacher. I tended to think about the natural world as backdrop for activity, as partner in crime for sure, but not as an active co-teacher. What is it like to make the natural world a co-teacher? How do you do that in practice? I'll give you an example. One of the things we do when we do education is we think about curricular design. We sort of design lessons. What does it mean to design a lesson if you actually have a partner that is the natural world? If you actually have a cedar tree that is your co-teacher, what does it mean to design that lesson? Well, a couple of things happen right off the bat. Number one, you have to spend time with this cedar tree. You have to get to know what their skills are. They're a partner in the teacher. You have to figure out what they're good at, how to give them space. You have to figure out, right, how to work together. So that's number one. You have to build a relationship, which I think is really important, and you all know that in terms of the natural world. Number two is you actually have to decenter yourself as human teacher. You have to move to the side a bit. You can't just be the only expert. You can't do all the planning. You can't be speaking all the time. You actually have to be quiet at certain points in time so that your students can encounter the other teacher. Now, another thing has happened, and that's been super, super interesting. If you start to decenter the human teacher, you actually have to change the very act of planning lessons. Right? So here in Canada, the classic thing to do in terms of planning lessons is you go, okay, what learning outcomes do I want? What do I want my kids to learn? What do I want the students to learn? What do I want the adults to learn? What do I want people I'm working with to learn? You start from there, and then you're like, okay, how can I get there? What experience could I use that would help them to learn whatever it is I want them to learn? Right? In North America terms and in North American curriculum design, that's Ralph Tyler. Ralph Tyler, professor at University of Chicago, sort of laid out this plan for how to do lesson plans. Right? Now, what happens when you do that? Well, one of the things that happens is you often funnel from experience down to learning outcome, right? Which means that you, the teacher, are kind of controlling everything as you go towards that learning outcome. If students start to move away from that, you'll pull them back. It's like, no, we got to get to the learning outcome. One of the things that falls out of that is that there are times where the students actually become really good at figuring out what it is you, the teacher, want them to learn. Right? So that, in fact, it's not so much the learning process, but what they have to do is they have to figure out, okay, what does Sean want me to learn? All right, I'm going to learn that thing. So one of the things we found at Maple Ridge, if you're starting to do this nature as co-teacher, it's helpful to do something we've lately been called invert the curriculum. You have to kind of flip it over, which means that there are experiences and encounters that happen. If you come in Maple Ridge, they come to the park. They're off walking around, or they've just met, and somebody finds something. Somebody notices the creek sound in the background, or somebody finds a pile of fresh bear poo. It's always bear poo for small kids, right? Or they notice that one of the trees has fallen and there's a different bird in the air. Whatever. There could be all kinds of different kinds of things. And then what happens for you as a teacher is that you start with the experience, you work with your co-teacher. But part of what your job is now as a teacher is to accompany us on the side, is to ask really good questions, is to facilitate this process for the students. So as the students get curious, as the students get excited, as they start to engage with the natural world, then what you do is you're asking questions that help them to make the next move, to help them to think into a different kind of area. But you're also, because in BC, what happens here is we have a provincial curriculum, and you're supposed to follow the provincial curriculum, and you're supposed to get to the learning outcomes of the provincial curriculum. Now, what's been really interesting at the Maple Ridge School is that we've helped the teachers, the human teachers, to learn the provincial curriculum so well that as they do these experiences with the students, they actually can track the learning outcomes as they fall out of the experiences. Does that make sense? So what's going on is that it's not the learning outcomes that are driving, it's the experiences, the place, the co-teacher that helps to drive, and the student's interest that helps to drive this conversation. And the teacher's job is to ask good questions that help to move and potentially have learning outcomes drop out of the bottom, but also to map what's going on and map the learning outcomes that are falling out and being able to keep track of them. So you're doing the work, but you're doing it in the inverse. So that's nature as co-teacher. You can play with that. I've got tons more that I could say about that, but I don't want to fill your day completely with this. I'm happy to have a conversation as we go forward because there's so much to talk about in this kind of thing. The last thing I want to talk about, and this is this exciting idea that I've been playing with, has got two pieces to it. So this is nature as co-imaginer. And then I want to tell you about one specific student at the Maple Ridge Environmental School, because I think it's actually a really, really hopeful piece. So if we back up a little bit, right? One of our arguments that's happened in the environmental field, and you know it, and you probably say it, and you probably said it lots, right? Is that part of changing the world and part of responding to the climate crisis, part of responding to the environmental crisis, is that we need to change our relationship to the natural world. It can no longer be anthropocentric. It can no longer be human elitist. We can no longer think of the natural world as just a resource for human use. We have to start to build a relationship, and a different kind of relationship, and a more equitable relationship at this point in time. So here's the quote that made us start to think about this. It comes from a paper by Sheridan and Longboat, and it comes out of the Haudenosaunee tradition. which is a Six Nations tradition, First Nations in southern Ontario and southern Quebec in eastern Canada, so a ways away from here. And so here's the quote. I'm going to read it directly so I don't mess it up. It goes like this. Imagination is understood to be a quality of mind in settler culture. All right? So does that make sense? What they're saying is that when settler culture, which is Western European culture, thinks about the imagination, they think about it as being a quality of mind. It's my imagination. All right? The rest of the quote. In Haudenosaunee Mohawk tradition, the same quality is understood to be animal and spiritual helpers manifesting their presence in one's life. So what's going on here? I think, and we can play with this, you can play with this, is that what they're saying is that, hang on a second, you've done the classic colonial thing. You've taken the imagination and you've made it a characteristic just of the human. You've separated it from the natural world and you've made humans elite because they have this thing called the imagination. And remember, the imagination includes thoughts and ideas. So what happens there? So what the Haudenosaunee are suggesting is that, in fact, the imagination is a shared space. It's a space of encounter. It's a space of working together. It's a gifting space. It's a place where the natural world can offer gifts, can communicate, can manifest itself in mind, in space, in human encounter. So what happens is that it's no longer my idea, it's our idea. In fact, it may not even be mine at all. It just happens to have been offered to me. And I happen to be able to translate it to you. Now, that for me has really, really interesting epistemological ramifications. It also has really, really interesting educational conversations. What do you start to say? It's like, wow, Anna, that's a fantastic idea. What that does is that's gone back to the settler quality of mind. What about, wow, Anna, where did that idea come from? Who's working on that idea with you? Who do you share that space with? Very, very different way of thinking about it. But it also, I think, starts to reach across the culture-nature boundary, the human, more than human boundary at that point in time. Because it starts to anchor us into the world in a very, very different way. Sheridan and Longbow continue, and they do a really, really interesting thing where they actually suggest that this imagination, if you start to think about it as a shared space, right, gets filled by the ideas of the natural world, right? These are gifts. These are spirit helpers. These are animal helpers who are giving us, who are making themselves manifest in these ideas. But they also say that part of making your mind mature, part of maturing into a place, part of becoming part of the place, part of connecting to the land, is to actually connect to the old growth, to old growth your mind. So let's remember that Douglas fir tree. That's 550 years old. What the Haudenosaunee are saying is that we need those because they're the wisest of the lot of us. They have the gifts that can manifest in our mind to help my own mind mature, to help me grow up, as it were, right? They're actually, remember that Suzanne Simard piece? They're actually creating potential rhizomes and communications not only to trees, not only to the plants, but also to us. And they're doing it through our imaginations. All right, that may be more than you wanted to hear, but what I want to do is I want to end with a quote from a student at the Maple Ridge Environmental School. At the point in time of this quote, she's about 8 or 9 years old, and she's trying to explain this experience she's having of talking to the world and being talked to by the world. And the reason I want to give you this quote is because I actually think it's incredibly hopeful. It's hopeful because I think it points to the possibility that modern folks who tend to be cut off from the natural world have a way to connect back into the natural world if they're given the chance. And this is what we do as environmental educators. We could potentially give them the chance to connect back into the natural world. Now we're going to have to create an envelope. We're going to have to support them. We're going to have to care for them because the rest of modernity isn't super excited about this connecting to the natural world and listening to trees and things like that. But maybe this is part of, I don't know, starting to move towards old growthing our minds and being differently in the world and being more indigenous to the places in which we live. This student, as I said, she's in the 4th grade, so she's about 8 or 9. She's chosen the name Raven. and she's talking to one of our researchers. And the researcher says, "So do you hear the plant?" And Raven says, "Yeah, but you have to hear it through your heart." Remember, this is an 8 or 9-year-old trying to explain an experience that she's having. The researcher, "I was going to ask where you hear it. Do you hear it in your heart?" Raven, little words curl into your mind. You have to know that you're not thinking. All right? Little words curl into your mind. You have to know that you're not thinking. Raven is already making a distinction between sort of rational, logical, modern mind and these things that are appearing in her mind. These are the spirit helpers, I think, potentially. These are the animal helpers. These are gifts being given to her. Finally, just so you can hear it, because I think it's amazing, this is another day the researcher is talking to Raven again. Raven says, "This sounds funny. You're focused on something, but you're not actually thinking about it. If you're thinking, then you're not really listening. See, I can't do it now when I'm talking." So here we have Raven offering us a kind of attention, a way of being in the world that's different. You can't be talking and you can't be thinking. Right? So the researcher then says, "You feel like you have conversations with the natural world." Raven says, "It's not exactly that. It's not speaking. It's more like energy or signals. You can't hear it out loud. It's something that your mind and only your mind can understand because nature is open to any language. So if you were just thinking, not even in your language, just showing pictures, it would still work." All right, so for Raven, this is what's being made manifest in mind, in this space. Right? There's a shared conversation going on. There's a dialogue going on. And it's a multi-vocal, it's a multi-languaged dialogue. Researcher, "The conversation you mean?" Raven, "Yes, it doesn't have to be speaking." Researcher, "So you mentioned energies and signals. What did you mean by that?" Raven, "Well, see, you speak your way. They speak different ways. Like thousands of different ways, billions. It's like the birds with those signals. Like when you see a bird flapping up in the sky and a flock of birds, how they all move at the same time. It's because they tell each other, like through mental speaking." All right, that's enough from me. What I want to do is I want to send you off another activity. You can go back to the place you were. Right? What would this place be as an educational partner? How would you plan? What are the possibilities for learning in this kind of space? Right? And how do you listen in this space? What does it mean to listen? What would it be how can you think about having this sort of shared space that is your shared imagination? What would this be to have nature as co-teacher in all of the work you do? That's enough for me. Thanks very much. I am going to walk away.
Hei kaikki! Mun nimeni on Arja Kaasinen ja työskentelen Helsingin yliopistossa biologian didaktiikan yliopiston lehtorina. Tänään puhun teille lyhyesti ulkona opettamisesta ja minulla on 4 villiä avainsanaa siihen liittyen. 4 siksi, että ne on helppo muistaa, ne on helppo laittaa takataskuun ja ottaa sieltä esille silloin, kun siltä tuntuu. Eikä oikein muista, että mitä ne asiat oli, mitä tässä ulkona opettamisessa on keskeistä ja tärkeää. Ja sitten myöskin sen takia, että ulkona opettaessa ja oppiessa täytyy olla vähän villi. Eli sen takia 4 villiä avainsanaa. Ensimmäinen avainsana on ihmettely tai verbinä ihmettele. Kaikki alkaa ihmettelystä. Ihan jos me mietitään mitä tahansa opettamista, niin ihmettely on ehkä se ensimmäinen asia. Aletaan ihmettellä, että mikäs tässä muuten oikein kasvaa? Miltä tämä näyttää? Miltä tämä tuoksuu? Mitä täällä ehkä kuuluu? Ehkä jotain voisi vähän maistaakin. Eli ihmettely on se ensimmäinen avainsana. Jos sen muistaa, niin ollaan jo todella pitkällä. Ihmettelystä kannattaa siis aloittaa. Ja toinen asia, mikä tähän ihmettelyyn liittyy ulkona, on sattuma. Se on aina ihme, kun jotakin jännää tapahtuu. Me ei voida välttämättä opettajina ennakoida lainkaan sitä, että mitä täällä ulkona meidän oppitunnin aikana tapahtuu. Ja mulla on esimerkkejä vaikka kuinka paljon, niin kuin varmasti teilläkin. Yksi äärimmäisen kiinnostava esimerkki on se, että juuri tässä metsässä tässä lähialueella kotiini on ihan tuossa vieressä. Viime kesänä, juuri näin kesäkuussa, liekko ollut juuri tämä päivä, ilves istui minun lähelläni noin 15 metrin päässä, syöksyi siitä kohti jänistä ja nappasi sen jäneksen suuhunsa. Ja se oli käsittämätön ihme. Ja me oltiin kaikki aivan, mitä mä nyt sanoisin, aivan siis ihmeissämme koko perhe, kun se tapahtui meidän silmien alla. Me päästiin keskelle sellaista luontonäytelmää. Eli sattuma ja siihen liittyvät ihmeet tekee niistä asioista merkityksellisiä ja ne jää meidän mieleen ikuisesti. Nyt en tarkoita, että sun täytyy hommata ilveksiä ja karhuja ja susia ja norsuja ja kirahveja sinne oppitunnille ja sinne metsään, vaan voi lähteä ihan pienistä yksityiskohdista. Se luuppi on yksi äärimmäisen tärkeä juttu ja ihan omat silmät. Katsotaan lähelle, katsotaan kauas, ihmetellään kaikkea, mitä täällä metsässä oikein on. Ne pienet ihmeet on suurenmoisia. Sitten taas toisaalta suuret ihmeet. Katsotaan taivaalle, katsotaan tähtitaivasta ja mietitään, että oho, siellä on noin paljon kaikenlaista. Siellä on tähtiä, toisia aurinkoja, galakseja, planeettoja, ties mitä. Sehän on ihan ihmeellistä ja kerta kaikkiaan upeaa. Ja tavallaan se osoittaa meille myös meidän paikan täällä meidän maapallolla. Kyllä tästä meidän maapallosta on syytä pitää hyvää huolta. Toinen avainsana on havainnointi. Ihmisen havainnointikyky on rajallinen. Me kyllä pystytään havainnoimaan monenlaisia asioita, mutta ei välttämättä kovin hyvin. Opettajana meidän täytyy opettaa meidän oppilaille, miten havainnoidaan ja antaa erilaisia tehtäviä sen havainnoinnin harjoitteluun. Kannattaa muistaa monet aistit, ei pelkästään näköaisti. Meidän koulu on hyvin näköaistipainotteinen jostain kumman syystä. Ulkona onneksi kaikki meidän aistit tulee hyvään käyttöön, mutta ne kannattaa ottaa myös ihan aktiivisesti käyttöön siellä ulkona. Elikkä ei paitsi katsota, myös kuunnellaan, myös haistellaan ja itikoita hätistellään. Ehkä maistellaan opettajan johdolla ja niin poispäin. Harjoitellaan tasapainoaista ja niin poispäin. Kaikki tällainen lisää sitä havainnointikykyä ja auttaa meitä ymmärtämään, miten monimuotoinen tämä meidän ympäristö oikein on. Ihan mahtavaa. Tässäkin, jos lähtisin katsomaan, niin löytäisin monta lajia ja voisin tutkia niitä. Eli muista avainsana numero 2, havainnoi. 3. avainsana on lumoudu. Kun lumoutuu luonnosta, mikään ei voi olla oppimisen esteenä. Lumoutuminen vaatii pysähtymistä, se vaatii tekemistä. Se saattaa tapahtua milloin tahansa. Se tapahtuu eri oppilailla eri asioista. Sen takia monipuolinen ulkona oppiminen mahdollistaa myös tämän lumoutumisen. Mulla olisi valtavasti esimerkkejä lumoutumisesta. Nyt mä oon itse täysin lumoutunut, kun mä oon täällä sananjalkojen alla ja koivujen alla ja mustikkakin tuossa mua lähentelee. On jotenkin ihana kesäpäivä ja on tosi lumoutunut tästä kauniista metsäluonnosta. Silloin kun lumoutuminen jollain tavalla koskettaa meitä, niin me tulee semmoinen olo, että hei, haluan pitää huolta tästä. Haluan, että tämä luonto säilyy tällaisena. Haluan, että käyn täällä itse säännöllisesti tai vien tänne mun omia lapsia joskus tai omia lapsiryhmiä. Eli lumoutuminen on tavallaan kaiken tämän perusta ja antaa mahdollisuuden myös vaikuttaa tai halun vaikuttaa. Se heilauttaa jotain meidän tunteissa ja herättää meissä halun pitää huolta meidän yhteisestä ympäristöstä. Lumoudu siis. 4. avainsana, mutta ei lainkaan vähäisin, on inspiroituminen. Me kaikki tiedetään, että kun jostain inspiroituu ja innostuu, niin mikään ei ole enää sen jälkeen oppimisen tai minkään muunkaan esteenä. Eli kannattaa yrittää saada se kipinä syttymään. Ja siihen kipinän syttymiseen tarvitaan oikeastaan niitä 3 aikaisempaa avainsanaa. Pitää ihmetellä, pitää pystyä havainnoimaan ja antaa oppilaille tilaisuuksia tehdä erilaisia havaintoja. Ja toivon mukaan sieltä syttyy myös lumoutumisen lamppu ja henki, jonka jälkeen ihan varmasti on jollain tavalla inspiroitunut täällä ulkona oppimisesta. Opettajille tämä on äärimmäisen tärkeä asia. Se madaltaa välittömästi kynnystä, koska tietää, että miten äärimmäisen tärkeää ja monipuolista ja miten hyödyllistä ulkona opettaminen oikeastaan on. Senpä takia me kaikki varmaan täällä tänään ollaankin ja halutaan inspiroitua, kuulla lisää, miten muut on inspiroitunut ja miten voisi itse inspiroida niitä omia oppilaita lisää. Nämä 4 käsitettä voisi oikeastaan niputtaa yhden käsitteen alle, nimittäin biodiversiteettikasvatuskäsitteen alle. Biodiversiteettikasvatus pyrkii siihen, että ihmiset ymmärtää, miten elää kestävällä tavalla. Eli kestävän kehityksen tarpeisiin pyritään biodiversiteettikasvatuksella. Ja missä muualla sen ymmärtäisi paremmin kuin täällä ulkona ja täällä metsässä ja luonnon keskellä. Täällä se tulee lähelle, täällä se tulee meidän sydämeen, täällä se tulee konkreettiseksi. Me halutaan pitää tästä hyvää huolta. Me halutaan, että tämän näkee myös meidän seuraavat sukupolvet. Me halutaan tietää, miten tämä kaikki toimii ja mikä meidän rooli tässä kaikessa monimuotoisuudessa on. Valitettavasti nämä uutiset luonnon monimuotoisuudesta on ollut aika ikäviä viime aikoina, joten oikeasti tähän biodiversiteettikasvatukseen on kiinnitettävä huomiota. Ja ulkona oppiessa se tulee kuin itsestään. Eli tämänkin takia kannattaa lähteä ulos. Ulkona oppiminen on ehdottomasti sydämen asia. Kun jotain tuolla rintakehässä heilahtaa, niin siitä haluaa kertoa myös muille. Kannattaakin kertoa rohkeasti niille omille oppilaiden vanhemmille ja omille kollegoille, miten mahtavaa ulkona on oppia ja opettaa. Koska se voi aluksi tuntua vähän oudolta ja se voi jopa jännittää. Pienin askelin kannattaa kuitenkin lähteä liikkeelle ja vähän kerrassaan tämä homma tulee tutuksi. Juttelisin äärimmäisen mielelläni teidän kanssa vaikka kuinka pitkään. Ja jos tästä syttyy sinulle jotakin ajatuksia, niin laita minulle viestiä tai kilauta. Mutta ihanaa ulkona oppimisen päivää kaikille. Moi moi!
Thank you very much, Sean and Arja, for your ideas and mind-opening thoughts. I'm going to comment both presenters using my experiences as an outdoor educator during the past 30 years. I start by explaining how I created my teaching team way back when I took my first steps as an outdoor educator. Nature as a co-teacher is something that fascinates me a lot. And nowadays I see it as an equal and an important co-teacher in my team. I couldn't do my teaching without it. I remember the time when I started to work with kids with special needs, behavioral problems, mental issues, lack of emotional control, etc. The teaching methods I had learned in the university in the beginning of 18th century, my teacher role, they did not work at all. I tried as well as I could to plan and control the learning. The result was totally dependent on my actions. All the decisions, methods, activities, what's important was managed by me, no exceptions. What I actually did, I was actually colonizing the curriculum. It all failed after a few months. I faced a severe burnout. Nothing worked out. I was done. At that moment, the only thing I was able to do was to take the kids for a walk in the nearby forest. And suddenly there, while walking in the forest, I discovered somewhat normal positive behavior and reactions, interest, wonder, even enchantment, cooperation, etc. What I had found was the first co-teacher in my team, the nearby forest we were able to enter with zero budget. And we started to make these forest trips several times a week, half a day at a time. And the result of those trips amazed me totally. Those kids, my students who used to show no motivation towards my teaching at all, were enchanted by the animals. They created games and plays on big boulders. Those who never worked together in the classroom, they hiked through the thick bushes because the compass needle told them to do so. I even tried to guide them to the higher ground using the open terrain, but no. They had discovered how the compass works and the compass they followed. No questions about that one. They started to ask questions. They observed the hedgehog skeleton, and suddenly I was needed. They guided me through the forest to find the best sled runs in the wintertime. And I discovered that I had found the third co-teacher and a lesson designer into my team, the students themselves. So that's how I got my curriculum and lesson designer community. Myself as a teacher, the surrounding environment, and the students. And I was wise enough to listen to them all. What the nature, the surrounding environment had to offer for learning, and what the students discovered, which was valuable, there to be learned. Actually, my students opened the real curriculum to me and the space around started teaching it. And the teaching became relevant, genuine, interesting, meaningful, and useful for all of us. As San said, I had to leave some space for my colleagues to speak out. I let it go. I left my colleagues also chance to teach. No more full control. Space for discoveries and observations. And I saw us all equal, the environment around me and the students. Instead of walking first, I let my students enter the nature or the learning space. In my case, it used to be the forest, swim hall, art exhibition, museums, theater, cafeterias, library, and not to forget the classroom itself. To discover, observe, get inspired, and the students, they were leading the process. They were showing the interest, and that was kind of the meaningful way of learning, because they get the importance for the learning, the content by themselves. So, and I can see that that's the only way I can keep the reactions, the inspiration, the learning real and genuine. It's not about me, it's all about them. So the result of that kind of a thinking makes the learning relevant for my students. And I let the students do the decisions. I had to let it go and lead the students to think what they want and need to learn. It was something new also for my students. And my task as one of the teacher team was to find the place, the learning space, the environment to match the curriculum and offer a safe learning environment for my students so they can freely start to discover what's there to be learned. And my responsibility was not to decide what to learn, was to support the process, to be there when the help was needed. So I was able to flip over the concept of learning. It was not about me, as I said. It was about the students, the interests of all of us. And then I added the impact of the nature, the environment around us, which always added its own part, making the learning result better I could ever have done alone. That's why I see that one of the most important educator skill is the cooperation with the environment around us. So I call those skills like environmental control skill or environmental teaching skills. And I wish I could always choose the environment in a way the learning happens between the students and the environment, and I don't have to stand in between, filtering or making the deciding decisions what's important. And I can just enjoy, I can sit down and watch and let my students tell me what they have learned. So the school, the learning space, is not separated from the existing world. The existing world is the school. And I see my role just as a guide or a translator or a mentor or support when needed, when I'm leading, guiding my students to the source of learning. To wonder, to observe, to enchant, to be inspired. I just finished up a kayaking guide course last Saturday, and the method of teaching the kayaking course follows this kind of an adventure educational method involving the students. And we also talked a lot about how to deal with different kind of groups in that kind of a high-risk environment. And while talking about the different methods and the setup was this kind of an adventure education, one of the students suddenly said, okay, this is not adventure education. This is just education, like in general. And what I told her was that, yeah, she's absolutely right. That I hope that this kind of an attitude, the way of seeing the learning, could cover everything, and we could just talk about the education, not separating it or classifying it into the adventure education. So thank you very much. I hope I did not go too far from the topic, and thank you very much for listening. Please go ahead, but please keep it simple.
Okay.
And easy.
Oh, I don't know if this one's going to be easy. Part of it is because I come out of the adventure field, right? That's my background. And one of the things that has been a critique of the adventure field is that it tends to fall into, at times, kind of conquering ideas, right? Getting to the top of the mountain, paddling the gnarly whitewater, doing all that kind of stuff. So I think there's a conquering motif. There's there's also kind of a weird sort of masculinist motif to it too, right? The sort of super strong male macho stuff that happens connected to that. I'm wondering if A, you've noticed that, how you yourself kind of wrestle with that, play with that in the field, and B, what happens if we think about nature as colonized in light of that kind of adventure discussion. Does that make sense, Kai, what I'm asking a little bit?
Yes,
and I don't
makes sense. Yeah. So the negative weight, the burden of the adventure education is the word adventure. And what I highlight and point out with each group in the beginning, that the adventure education is not at all about the extreme sports. So, and I was talking about the equalism, to being equal. So we are visitors into nature. And as I said, that I'm actually expanding the learning environment for everything which is around us. So, and it's a relief for my students when they discover or when they are told that you don't have to be a kind of a Superman to do this kind of an adventure educational things. It is I would actually prefer the word experiential learning instead of adventure education. But the word adventure education itself is better than the experiential learning. So we keep to that term. But you're right with that one. I think that it's a little bit like an old school thinking that it should be like a masculine and conquering and like that one. So, and that's the basic value, what we teach in HUMAC adventure education, that we are visitors, we are equal, because that's the only way how we can transfer the sustainable development values or environmental, taking care of the environment, and we may believe that that we can make the world to be better, to fight against the climate exchange and that kind of things.
Nice. Yeah, thanks. That makes sense to me. I realize for a lot of the teachers that I work with and a lot of the outdoor folks that I work with, playing with this nature as colonized thing actually repositions ourselves. So not only as equal, but also as responsible for the damage that's being done, So there's a sort of sense of coming to recognize my own privilege and the way in which that privilege sits on the natural world and the costs that have been borne by the natural world in terms of my being this kind of privileged thing. And I think that for us anyway, that helps a little bit in the conversation you're talking about in terms of thinking about being equal and advocating for the natural world. But it also adds a kind of layer of responsibility to that. If we're going to take seriously that the natural world is colonized, then I need to think about how I am in the world, who I be in the world, right? How I use those kinds of things.
But the thinking is there. The interesting thing what happened now during the COVID pandemic, during the last year and a half, was that I was actually expecting that since everything was closed, that the folks in Finland, they would go and just buy the liquor store empty and start sipping wine and booze and just enjoying the Netflix and the being couch potato. But no, what actually happened? Every single outdoor store is sold out. But what actually happened, like during in the capital area down in the southern Finland, actually the colonizing the nature started. Because let's take the Nuuksio National Park. A lot of folks there, and like hundreds and hundreds of wild, unlegal fireplaces, or people the mountain bikers, they drive their mountain bikes wherever, and if there's a path, they go to the path. They don't just care who does it belong to. Is it legal to go on that one, or if they see the erosion, no, they just go around the swamps and like that, and there's more erosion. So I see that kind of a colonizing the nature again. So we have a lot to do to teach that kind of an equal attitude, living side by side with the nature.
So what would be the first step for a teacher to take to make the nature their co-teacher? So how do you accomplish that?
Nice. It's a great question. We work tons with teachers who are wanting to do this kind of work. A couple of things that I think to start. One is take the idea actually seriously, right? Just go, okay, nature as co-teacher, right? I'm going to take that seriously. Pretend, right, like you were working with another human teacher. So a couple of things you can do. One, you can go to the place where you think the teaching is happening outside and co-plan. Just sit in that space, come to know that space, spend some time in that space, build a practice of being in that space, and then try and leave some space so that you can plan whatever the lesson might be in this particular kind of space. Number one. Number two, and this is going to sound a little bit weird, but we're allowed to be wild at this point in time. Satu says so.
Yes.
I think leave your windows open in your classroom, because what's going to happen is a bee is going to fly in, or a spider is going to come in, or something is going to appear, right? The outside is going to come in. You can't keep it out. And then I think, and this happens a lot for teachers who are just trying it out, let that spider come in and then let that spider be discovered. And then rather than doing what most people would do, either like squash the spider or capture the spider and throw it out, right? Go, okay, what's going on? Kai was giving these kinds of examples. There's like, what are the questions the students have? What are the excitements the students are generating? What's the enchantment that's happening at that point in time, right? As Arya was saying, what's the wonder that you see at that point in time? And then part of our job as educators is just to kind of ask good questions, notice what's happening, right? What are you doing? So tiny little steps, like just get outside a little bit, set up a like wonderful walking Wednesdays and go out for the afternoon on Wednesday. I assume there's a Finnish alliteration that would work. I don't know. Those are a few ideas. I'm sure Arya and Kai have a bunch too.
Yeah, thanks. I usually can hear the question that the nature is so far away. It's so hard to go outdoors and have outdoor education. So as Sean said, that just open the window or jump
from there, or open the door and go to the schoolyard. It's very close. It's not maybe the forest, or it's not a park, but there is something. So just go to your schoolyard first. And I think also it's good to remember that we teachers and we adults have to grow and create our nature relationships as well, because it might be that in our childhood we haven't been in nature so much. So, but it's possible also when we are adults. So that's also what I wanted to say.
Can I? Okay, Kai, you want to continue?
Just a short comment to Sean, that you have to be careful how do you instruct teachers to leave their doors and windows open, because I once left my classroom door open and a big hawk flew in and banging from wall to wall. But you can imagine what kind of a learning moment that was, catching the big bird and then just bring it out inside my jacket, rolled into my jacket, and you were just observing that one. The teacher role in Finland is traditionally very, very strong. And there has to be kind of a different kind of a mindset for the teachers, that, as you said, that you have to know the environment, the nature first. So go in there and sit down and listen what the nature has to told you. But I would say that the other thing is that I just took my students into the nearby forest and I left them walk first. So they were doing the discoveries. They were finding the direction where to go, and I was just following them. And I was impressed how much they were able to discover.
Excellent example. There is actually, we have now ended up by the fact that posing good questions is essential and central for proceeding well. And so there's a lot of questions about posing questions, like who poses the questions. If the nature is the co-teacher, and kind of the teacher should present the good questions, and in a way now, because we think that in learning, the students should pose their own questions. So what about this mess with the questions? So who does the questions and how does it go? Who wants to answer this question? Kai.
So, yeah, the way I did it was that I was there, I was present. And when the first questions came in, I was answering if I was able, or we were thinking together and just wondering what has happened here. And that's how it started. So I don't see myself anymore as a teacher. I'm a mentor, I'm a coach, I'm a guide. I'm a support. Sometimes I'm a source of information, but in the most cases, I say that, okay, what do you think yourself? And find out the answer yourself. It's not a mess, because the questions are valuable. If there are a lot of questions, I'm only happy. If there is shortage of time that we don't have the time to answer all the questions, that's better than having no questions and I have to talk loud and kind of make the content.
Okay, do we have further answers to these questions?
I have a couple of quick thoughts. One has to do with trust, and I use this a lot when I talk to teachers, sort of trusting not only the students and learners, that they will sort of generate questions, that questions will appear, that they'll have curiosities, that these kinds of things will happen. The second trust, and I think Kai is pointing in this direction too, right, is trust the natural world, that things will happen. Right? Often early teachers sort of like, they want the eagle to catch the fish out of the pond. They want these like giant things to happen, right? Or the lynx to come through the backyard and catch the rabbit, those kinds of things. But I think our students, they get excited by things that are tiny, small, all over the place, and the natural world will provide. And that, in some ways, when we talk about this in Wild Pedagogies, is like us as human expert teacher giving up some of our control, giving up this sort of sense. And that can be a really tricky thing for a teacher to do, right? To step back and go, okay, I'm going to let this happen. I'm going to trust these kinds of things. That then means, I think, for us, it also has this effect on what we think knowledge is and where knowledge is located. I've done a lot of work trying to help our teachers to not try to answer the question that a child brings to them, or to not try to totally answer a question, right? A child will show up and like, why is the sky blue? And the teacher is like, well, it's got stuff to do with this, and that's the universe, and there's dust in there, yada, yada, yada. Never, the answer is never complete, right? But I think what you do is you're in some ways lying to the child in odd ways, right? You're telling the child that you know the answer, even though you don't actually totally know the answer. 2, that the answer is knowable by humans, right, in a particular kind of frame. So I think more questions that open space, questions that are drawn from the child. If we play with this idea of the imagination as being a shared space, then in fact the child's questions are questions that have been generated by this place, by these encounters, by these moments.
We have done a lot of work throughout the years to make environmental and outdoor education to look like well-planned teaching that is capable of aiming to targeted learning objectives and outcomes. So because we didn't just want it to look that we're fooling around and playing outdoors with no clue. So is there a risk that it's when we do not have specific outcomes that we target? So is there a risk maybe in this approach?
Well, maybe I can start. I think we just have to rethink the whole education again, and we have to rethink the outdoor education. So maybe this is the basic thing what we have to think. We have to rethink that there is possibilities that it looks like that we are not doing nothing special, or we are just hanging around, but there is happening a lot. So maybe this is something what we just have to think ourselves, and we have to, for example, we have parents events. We have to tell to the parents if they are worried about that you are just walking around and the students are not learning anything. So we just have to tell them about the pedagogy behind of this outdoor education. Maybe it's something what we have to think.
Yes, wonderful. Any other comments on this?
I have a bundle of comments. I'll try to keep them short. So yes, it is a potential danger. Absolutely. Right. But a couple of things I think have to play into it. One thing that we saw a lot at the Maple Ridge Environmental School was that the teachers who started at that school, they came out of the traditional system and then went into this outdoor school, right? They came assuming that you got rid of structure by leaving a school and you went into no structure at all. And that's actually not the case, right? I think it's a different kind. If you think it's no structure, then you are going to head in this what could be problematic direction of just like running around with no framing at all, right? There is a structure. Those of us who are outdoor educators, right? I was totally shocked watching these teachers because I was like, hey, you guys don't know how to hold the space. You don't know how to shape a day. You don't know how to breathe in and follow the students' learning. You don't know how to like make a particular area sacred. And here's a particular runaround area. And here, right? You don't know how to do any of those kinds of things. That's not part of the training. It's not their fault. It just wasn't part of the training. And what I didn't realize as an outdoor educator was like, I had all these skills that I didn't actually know why I had, if that makes any sense, right? So that's number one, sort of recognizing the skills, recognizing the structure, recognizing the shape. Number two, and we do this a ton with our teachers, because our teachers are responsible for the curriculum. They're BC provincial teachers, so they have to do the curriculum. But the way in which we do it is we think about it as being this inverting of the curriculum. So that what your job as a teacher is you actually have to really know the learning outcomes. You really have to know the provincial curriculum, right? Then you co-teach. And as things are happening, you're then, oh, there's a learning outcome. There's a learning outcome. There's a learning outcome. And you're noting those things, right? At the end of the day, you might have to fill them in. You might have to keep track of it. That's the kind of work that you're doing. So you're actually fulfilling the curriculum. And then some of the questions that you step in to offer are, in fact, potential questions that might lead in particular directions because you're like, we haven't had enough history, right? So you'll ask a kind of interesting sort of what happened in this place, right? How do we know? right? So that you can get to some of those other learning outcomes that you think are not actually happening. The advantage to that is that you're trusting your co-teacher, you're trusting your learners, you're getting a much more diverse range of learning outcomes out of any particular entity. My sense is if you plan and then you direct the learning outcomes, you funnel towards particular learning outcomes, but you lose a whole lot of other things if you reverse it. But then you have to be able to notice it. I don't know. Did that make sense?
So it's about kind of measuring or keeping track that what are the outcomes that you make on the way, in a way.
Yeah, exactly. Rather than having the outcomes drive everything you do.
Yeah, Kai.
Yeah, it's a challenging way of teaching because you have to prepare it so super well. You have to know the environment where you take your students in, that you know that the learning elements are there for the students to find out. And you have to be good for managing the process. It's about process management, that you observe, you follow it, and with little questions or a little bit of a guiding, you keep the students on the track, which is parallel with the curriculum. So, and I've taught to my students that if you just go out there, something happens and the day was funny and exciting, you come back. That's only circus. That's an adventure. But it's not educational. You have to go there with some kind of a plan and to come out with some kind of a result, what we also call the transfer effect. Then it's adventure education. Otherwise not. Excellent. But to keep it genuine and real and relevant, you have to have this kind of a cooperation with the environment and the students.